rights activist, women rights activist, and has dedicated the last 35 years to transforming education. She also co-chairs the Catalyst 2030 Education Group, where together with other social innovators, she's driving collaborative systems change. Urvashi is both a Schwab and Ashoka Fellow, a non-resident fellow at the Center for Universal Education Brookings Institution, and has been nominated for a multitude of awards and accolades, which would take up our whole session. But she has been nominated by the state government of Uttar Pradesh in India to join the steering committee of primary and secondary education groups. It combines that activism with policy change as well. We also have Ambridget Alberston, who has been CEO of the Lego Foundation since September, and her career brings together campaigns, policy, and now funding for social innovations. Prior to Lego, Ambridget served as CEO of Plan International and has held roles at UNDP, both at the headquarters and in field in Indonesia. She's also spent time leading country operations in Turkey, Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan for the United Nations Population Fund. So welcome, Ambridget. Really keen to hear about the innovative approaches that the Lego Foundation are taking to change and redefine education. We also have Noah Sobey, who is Senior Program Officer at UNESCO, where he works with the Futures of Learning and Innovations team that helped to prepare the recently released UNESCO's Future of Education report, titled Reimagining Our Futures Together, a New Social Contract for Education. So we're really pleased to have Noah here. He's past president of the Comparative and International Education Society, CIES, and is at UNESCO while on extended leave of absence from his faculty position at Loyola University in Chicago. So we're looking forward to hearing about the Reimagining Futures report and what that means for collaborative action. So welcome, Noah. And last but no means least, Dr. Rana Dajani, who holds expertise in epigenetics and biomarkers of trauma amongst refugees and across generations, and is a world expert on genetics of Circassian and Chechen populations in Jordan. Again, Rana has been, she's been awarded the Jordan Star of Science by His Majesty King Abdullah II. And how she has the time with all of that, but Rana leads a community-based model, We Love Reading, which focuses on changing mindsets through reading to create change makers. For this work, she's been recognized by the Clinton Global Initiative, received the UNESCO International Literacy Prize in 2017, a World Literacy Council Award in 2018, the Jacob Social Entrepreneurship Award in 2018. She's also an Ashoka Fellow, UNHCR Nason Refugee Awardee in 2020, and is newly appointed Schwab Social Entrepreneur for 2022. So this is going to be quite some session. So without further ado, I will hand you over to Urvashi. Over to you.
Thank you, Deepa, and welcome all. Welcome to the panelists and also everyone in the audience here and on our live stream. Dive into it right away, redefining education. I remember the MDGs, and with the EFA, the major concern and focus was get kids into school, provide access. So many children out of school, let's get them in. And then with the SDGs, the focus shifted to quality education. And then, of course, there was the whole issue of how to define quality. I think that's been the conversation of the last decade. I remember 2012, when the UN Secretary General launched his first Education First initiative. Then Brookings came up with its breadth of learning approach. And our own in India, our national education policy has given, it's a great policy. And it talks about moving education away from rote learning, away from transferring of information, away from assessment-driven ways of teaching and learning in school, and making it more closer to analytical thinking and creative thinking of the 21st century. And having said all of that, I think with all these great policies and documents floating around everywhere, the new definition, when you look at the education systems themselves and the large ones, like India, for example, they're still very, very archaic. And on the ground, the reality is same old, same old, same. At Catalyst 2030, we are working at shifting the narrative. I co-chair the education group, and we recently commissioned a report where we defined new learning principles in collaboration with all the stakeholders, with educators, with education innovators, with the students themselves, with policymakers and funders too. And we came up with 8 learning principles, saying that education should be learner-centric and learner-led. It should teach children how to live as well. Focus on social emotional learning, well-being, critical thinking, and also focus on self-development. That it should be have a strong focus on social justice, with open discourse of power in the classroom. Around gender equality, around race and caste relations, class relations. It should focus on learning a living, on vocational training, entrepreneurship, and financial education. And it should be focusing on sustainability education, on active citizenship, on accessible and inclusive learning, and peace education, thinking of conflict zones. First of all, working towards a future that won't have conflict. But while there is, then what do you do? How should children be educated to cope with that? And then, of course, transforming learning ecosystems. So that report is in progress, and we're very excited about it. And the goal with that is to really try and shift the narrative around education, to redefine it, not just in principle, but also in practice. I'm so glad that we have these wonderful panelists today. I welcome Anne-Brigitte and Rana and Noah. And I'm excited to talk about what everyone has been doing to shift the narrative. I know there are so many social entrepreneurs all over. I know Anne-Brigitte, Lego Foundation has been doing a great deal with a focus on play as a way of learning. And so I would love to begin with you to tell us a little about what Lego Foundation has been doing to shift the narrative and what you think you need to do more. And how would you redefine it?
So Vashim, you've certainly made my job in answering your question a lot easier, because the vision that you have just laid out is obviously a vision that we at the Lego Foundation share and share deeply, and have worked on since the foundation of our organization 40 years ago. A deep belief that the power must shift in the classroom, a deep belief that the outputs of learning and education, formal and informal, need to help the entire life of the individual that comes through the learning system, and not particular reading or math skills, but really the whole person needs to come out at the end of a learning journey. And that, frankly, that learning journey is not finished when you're 18 or 25, but it's a lifelong learning journey. So that's very much our core philosophy. Part of that is also to promote the power of play, because we know that whether we are in kindergarten or in school or at work, if there's joy and playfulness and agency and collaboration and even physical activity, we learn, and actually we learn while we're not told we're learning. And sometimes being in an environment when you're not told that now you're learning, contrary to now you're playing, if we can combine the two, we can actually create that joy of learning that carries a human being throughout life. The ultimate aims of education and learning you have just articulated so wonderfully. So what is the role of a funder in that environment? And that's one that's been slowly shifting at the Lego Foundation, and we're very much still on a journey of identifying what's the best. How can we be the best funder in this space? Not just the largest or the ones with the most partners, but actually be the best. And the journey that we're on is very much that of enabling multiple stakeholders and partners around the change, not simply focusing on teacher training or support for parents or school or the school institution or the Ministry of Education, but working with everybody who can actually change the ecosystem. And where we have done that most successfully, as far as I can see, having come into this fairly recently, is in our focus countries, in countries where we have a long-term presence, a collaboration with the entire ecosystem of stakeholders around education, along the lines of what you were explaining before, when you get everybody together, make discrete funding, have conversations, bring networks together, catalyze change in all sorts of different ways. And we have until today had 4 focus countries, so Denmark, Mexico, South Africa, and Ukraine. As we move into our next strategy, we will increase the number of focus countries and try and see if we can stimulate change makers around transforming education in multiple geographies across the world. I'll leave it at that for now.
All music to my ears, Anne. Especially the fact that there's such a huge synergy, and that's exactly what Catalyst 2030 is trying to do. We're trying to achieve systems change. And I think you'll agree that unless we can get the larger system to change, social entrepreneurs are doing all their great work where they are. And at the same time, big systems seem to be oblivious of these workable solutions that we are presenting that have achieved impact, that are achieving the SDGs. And actually helping governments achieve their goals, and to be ignoring that. And that's really the purpose of our working group and the report we're producing, hoping that that will help, that we can use that as a tool and collaborate with organizations such as yours and others, where we can effect this kind of change. Noah, I would really, if you tell us, I know that you've been working, and that's how I met you, when you were working at the Futures of Education report, and I know that Catalyst 2030 partnered with you on that, and as did my organization and yours, Rana. And I know that the purpose of that is really to redefine education. So if you tell us a little about that and what you're doing with it.
Thanks, Urvashi. It's great to be here today. Thanks for having me in. Yeah, I mean, I can come at it in a very complementary way to what Anne Brigitte was just talking about, you know, from the perspective of an intergovernmental organization that's trying to work in this space, that's trying to be a thought leader that encourages others, and that convenes others for these conversations. So most recently, we did that at UNESCO through a 2-year process of visioning and foresight around education. This is actually something that UNESCO's done once a generation. Previous editions were the Fore Commission report in 1972 and the Delors Commission report, Learning the Treasure Within, in 1996. Beginning in 2019, under the leadership of Her Excellency, Madam Sahle-Work Zewde, the President of Ethiopia, we convened an international commission of 17 global thought leaders, but also, as Urvashi mentioned, you know, catalyzed a global conversation that in the end included over 1 million people who shared their ideas, their hopes, their fears, their visions for the future. So from the very beginning, this was a project that was about getting everybody together. And I mean, I think I might be saying something people are really familiar with, but that is so important for where we are right now. You know, it's you know, extremely evident to many people that, you know, our world's at a turning point, you know, and if we're honest with ourselves, we know that doing more of the same, even if faster and more efficiently, is propelling us towards a cliff. So, you know, the commission in its report basically put forward, you know, the fact that we face a choice. We can continue on an unsustainable path, or we can radically change course. And we know that education is one of the ways that you know, we can bring about change. Knowledge and learning are crucial for any social transformation. But you know, as you're noting, today the way we organize education doesn't do enough to ensure justice, peace, a healthy planet. And in fact, some of our difficulties stem from how we educate. So the argument put forward in this new UNESCO report, and maybe someone can put a link to it in the chat, or I can figure out how to do that in a second, but is basically that we need a new social contract for education that can both repair past injustices while transforming the future. And that, I think that sort of dual gaze, looking at, what explains the gaps we have today and how do we need to fix them? And then what do we need to change for the future need to be fused together in any kind of futures work. So, I mean, a key piece of this is changing the narrative around education. I think, I would subscribe, and many of us would probably subscribe to the idea that we can't change how we do education, how we do schools, until we change why we do it, right? And for too long, our education systems have, not supported the kinds of things Anne-Brigitte was talking about, not supported a view of the full flourishing of the human being, a view of the necessity of well-rounded learning that encompasses play, that encompasses emotional development, as well as cognitive development. Too often we focus solely on individual accomplishment in classrooms and in educational situations. And, the strongest argument put forward by the commission is that that's where we need to completely reorient towards building collective and individual capacities to work together to transform. I'll just close by saying, in the consultations, in all the conversations, and Urvashi, this came up in some of our conversations with the focus groups you organized, there is a keen awareness across the globe that we are together, that we're connected, right? COVID reinforced our awareness of our interdependencies. Our interdependencies are a fact, but we clearly need to get much better at working together, because the problems we face in the world now are ones that are going to require collective collaborative action. And that ethos needs to be installed as the core guiding principle of our education system. So I'll close with that. Thanks.
Thank you, Noah. I couldn't agree more. In fact, what you said, Anne-Brigitte, it almost reminds me of, happiness to be got must be forgot. So learning to be got must be forgot, and it should happen as we live, right? And learning is for living, which is true. And Noah, you talked about how we need to work together, and that's exactly what Catalyst 2030 is trying to do, is bring people together. We have 1,600 social entrepreneurs in Catalyst 2030, and the goal is that how can we work together? And I read your LinkedIn, and while I was doing my little research, and you said that you really believe in breaking silos. And that's exactly what Catalyst 2030 is about. How can we break silos? How can we talk across? And one of the unique things about our report is that in honoring the principles that we have laid down, we are trying to bring in youth voices and getting them to endorse the principles. What do they want? And some of the FGDs that we've held, they're echoing everything that you have said, Anne, and you have said, Noah. And they want that. The important thing is that how do we impact huge, humongous, resistant government systems to pick that up? These are tried and tested solutions. It's what everybody wants. So how do we get them to shift their narrative? Prana, you probably work in the toughest area than any of us. And I know you do your good work every day. But Rana, tell us. So how would you redefine education with your work? How are you trying to shift the narrative? And what more do you need to make this happen?
Yeah, everything that has been said is music to not just my ears. I think many of those who are listening of what are the principles, those pillars, those values that we have identified and we want to go forward and change. But I'm always the critical person, the scientist who's always critiquing and wanting to see how can we actually do that. I want a roadmap. I want to leave this session knowing what's the next step. And so I draw from real life experiences on the ground. And this is one of the strengths of Catalyst. We have all these stories and all these real life experiences that we need to listen to. People talk about the problems and the challenges, and we have very beautiful abstract solutions that we talk about. How do we actually go do something? And I'm going to start by giving a short example of what we do on the ground, and then go from there to something concrete that we can go home with. So at We Love Reading, I realized that all the education systems are always focused in a very, as you mentioned, siloed, very top down, focusing on how can I grab the child and I have to force him to come. How can I attract the child? It's always putting the cart before the horse rather than the other way. And what we did is we invoked evolution and biology and looking at the brain and the child and how they evolve and how their brain develop and their personality. And how do we motivate a child to want to learn, not because they have to, but because they want to? Because that is systems change. That's when you're going to the pivotal root cause. Because if you fix that, you fix the whole system from the grassroots, and you avoid a lot of the challenges that will escalate later. Because you have this child who's wanting to learn, seeking opportunities wherever they are. And as Urvashi said, we work with refugees or war disaster areas or natural disaster areas where the children, there's no school system to start with. So it's not about putting up a school system or training the teachers, as Anne Brigitte said. It's about how do I help the child, prepare him or her, and have them ready for this unpredictable future within this disaster area, or as Noah was saying, in 50 years from now, we don't even know what it's going to look like. How do we prepare our children for that new world that we don't even know? So the idea is to put that motivation, because if they love it, it's beyond the classroom, it's beyond age. You become a lifelong learner, and therefore you keep on going forever, and you create because you've got the skills. So how do we do that? We thought we need to identify those, the grassroots, which are different from different entrepreneurs around the world, have identified things that relate to their own community, to their own culture, to their own context. Again, there's not one solution for all. People are unique, back to biology. Our DNA is different. And there's no human being like another. And therefore, we will not learn the same way. Our needs will be different. Our motivations may be different. So how do we celebrate that diversity? Right? And while identifying the uniqueness of every human being, and allow them to discover their inner potential, and the outer world around them. So what we did at We Love Reading is we found out it's not about having a better school or a better teacher. Those are good, but to me, these are band-aids. It's about allowing a child to fall in love with reading for fun. Back to your play. How do I let reading is fun, that they can't wait to get a book under the blankets or up a tree or waiting for a bus or in a train or wherever they are? Because if they fall in love with reading, you've given them the skills and the tools to keep on engaging and fostering that curiosity and the critical thinking skills and listening and empathy with others and everything that has been spoken about. So we found the pivotal point, and we focused on developing a training program to train adults to read to children, to discuss, so that the child falls in love with reading, and then the adult also finds their voice through reading aloud to the children to become change makers. And that's why our motto is creating change makers through reading by changing mindsets, right? So we change the mindset through reading, and then now we have change makers. Which brings me to the last point. If every child grows up realizing that they have the agency and the potential and the curiosity, and they believe in themselves, that they can be the change makers to solve their local problems, then we are addressing all those SDGs and other development goals that are going to come out in the future, because every human being now sees themselves as a social entrepreneur and a change maker. So how do we allow? So the question becomes, how can I take education, and through education, reimagining it to help every child to grow up to be a change maker? And we believe it's through community engagement, identifying new members in the community who we never thought would be part of this, because we are removing all the old system and coming up with a whole new system, focusing on pivotal points, just reading. It doesn't have to be complicated, doesn't have to be sophisticated. Little things go a long way. And harking back how we evolved as a species. We're pretty smart, we've survived. And we didn't have elaborate schools at that point. And I think the more we're becoming more structured and institutionalized, the more we're losing, as was mentioned earlier. So how can we scrap all that and come up with a new thing? It's trusting local people. And one last point here I'm going to mention is that, unfortunately, many of the solutions that we read about and talk about are very driven global north and lack the voice of the global south. And through Catalyst 2030, we have been able to raise those voices and make them visible so that people now can, learning is going both ways. And we've realized with COVID-19 that the global North is suffering as much as the global South, and we are only as safe as the last human being on Earth. So we need each other. So how can we create these collaborations on equal footing? And I think a Catalyst, as we've experienced, has actually done that. And in a very short period of 2 years, we've done so much. So imagine going forward, what's going to happen, because ultimately this is what global systems change is about. It's bottom up with all the stakeholders, including government, funders, and everyone else. I'll stop there.
Rana, yeah, making it local and making it responsive. For a long time, we heard a lot about child-centric education. I think the more important to be child responsive, that it should respond to people's needs. What do they want to learn? What do they need? And what do they need in their specific local context? Really important. COVID in the last 2.5 years, it actually redefined everything. It forced everyone to look at everything afresh. And there were huge challenges. And I think education suffered hugely because of that. I mean, who would have ever imagined the school would shut down for 2 years, maybe 3 years, all over the world? It threw many challenges, but I think it also threw up many opportunities to do things differently. And I know, especially speaking from India, it has forced the government also to look at things differently, to look for new solutions, and actually become a little more responsive to social entrepreneurs and innovators on the ground, because they just need solutions desperately. I think this is really an opportunity. So my question to all of you, really, and maybe Anne will start with you, is that in what way did that help, hamper, hinder your efforts? Or what new lessons came from your partners? And what insights did they present?
Well, thanks for that. I think maybe a good place to start is where Rana ended, which is, we know that context is king or queen, depending on where we start from, but at least context is the only place to start. And local champions and their response to COVID was the only place to start for us. So if I look at it just from a very parochial, well, how did the Lego Foundation actually evolve positively during COVID? We grew our number of local partners threefold, while we significantly contributed to the global vaccine effort through global multilateral institutions and the COVAX scheme, etc. We also spread out through existing local and national partners to grassroots organizations, simply to be there where the need was the greatest. So we find ourselves today with a much greater diversity of partners on this transformation journey, and we're learning from them every single day. It's not about us transferring knowledge from the global North. It's really about us learning together. How do you catalytically fund so that you can do systems change? And that would not have happened without COVID, not nearly as fast as it did. I have to say that we're obviously therefore also seeing some of the best and brightest and smartest ways to educate outside the formal system, or to create learning spaces for the youngest children, as well as through primary and secondary education. Love to partner with others to really amplify some of what we've found and seen during that period. I think, though, we're also seeing, and I want to link that also over to Noah's report, that we know what the world needs. And yet, COVID has also created a massive setback of investments in education, let alone smart investments in education. We are potentially, on the back of the war in Ukraine, also going to see a massive disinvestment, not because anybody's really driving that, but in school feeding programs, in other activities that drive children into school. We're also seeing that programs for inclusion of refugee children, of children with disabilities are being defunded because we're seeing both governments and philanthropic funders drive more into the health space, into the climate change space, governments into the defense space, other things. And so while maybe I'd say 6 months ago when I started, I was very much on the, we've got to use COVID to be this massive driver of education transformation. Lovely story, but also a word of caution that there's a real emergency going on in terms of funding, of learning, of education for children of all ages. And I'm hoping anybody listening here will use their power and their voice and their catalytic energy to get the governments that are going to the Transforming Education Summit in September in New York to really have a true collective call for just putting education back on the priority list and making sure that we don't lose the gains that we made over the past 15, 20 years in the education space. Because I mean, personally, I feel there's a real risk. I don't want to dampen the mood, but we're actually at a critical moment where we risk losing an awful lot more than we're gaining.
Yes, and in fact, what worries me is, along with everything that you mentioned, that, you know, because children, everyone was held hostage by technology in these last 2 years. Schools shut down and that was the only hope. Of course, made very apparent, right? And all the stark inequalities that always existed. But somehow now, I hear this all the time. Just yesterday, our Prime Minister announced that, oh, we should focus on hybrid learning. That technology seems to have become this panacea, that if we can do that, then we can do everything. And that is really worrisome. I think the good thing is that people are thinking beyond school. They're thinking of distributed models of learning spaces and teaching spaces, which is the good thing. They're thinking of learning teams instead of one teacher, one classroom model. And though that has all emerged also from the ground because of COVID. But at the same time, once again, putting education on the priority and keeping some of those lessons and then moving on. Noah, tell us what you think about
Well,
COVID.
I'm just to
your report came out during COVID, so
yeah, and it was shaped by it in some interesting ways. I mean, as I said earlier, I mean, I think COVID reminded us of our interconnections, our interdependencies. As Anne-Brigitte just said, it also reminded us or showed, you know, what many knew, but some pretended not to know, a lot about our fragilities, right? And our deep inequalities. You know, I think it also made many governments realize that public health and other emergencies can't be faced without the help of society, you know, through self-responsibility, through mutual caring, you know. So in a sense, you can say, I think that the social has been rediscovered. And I think that's very important. And of course, you know, that's at the heart of Catalyst 2030's work. And then also on your last point, Urvashi, you know, I do think we learned something about education and technology. You know, before COVID, what had kind of been a hypothetical, what happens if we close schools and move everything into domestic spaces through platforms and digital devices, you know, that hypothetical actually was field tested. And I think the lesson that was clearly learned was that we cannot completely displace education into virtual spaces. Virtual spaces have a place in our life, you know, and a place in our education, and a place in our societies. I think we all would agree we need to get better at using those spaces. There's a lot of learning to be done, but we cannot do without classrooms. We cannot do without schools or other kinds of institutions and programs that bring people together to learn with and from each other. I want to agree, though, with what Anne-Brigitte said, that there's some real risks right now. There's real risks to funding austerity, education being on the short end of the stick on that. I agree entirely with the call to making sure that funding for education remains, is actually even improved, and the Transforming Education Summit that the UN Secretary General is convening in September at UNESCO. We're doing a pre-summit at the end of June. I think those are really important moments for people to come together. The one thing I would just maybe add is at this moment, where initially we thought this is a lot about new possibilities. And I agree. I think one of the ways that the COVID shaped the preparation of the UNESCO report is that it did show us overnight that the future could be different. And that kind of opening of possibilities, I think, is useful. But at this point, I think we need to be really careful that what comes next is not a narrowing of curricula, not a restricting. I think we need to keep our focus on going well beyond simple fundamental basic skills of literacy and numeracy, as important as they are. And then in the effort to recover and rebuild, we cannot lose the transformation agenda. We cannot lose everything we've been talking about the need to bring more people in, about the need to form principles together, about the need to both rely on and build capacities for collaborative action.
Anna?
Yeah, so to build on that, again, I believe from a scientific point of view is sometimes it's not about narrowing or expanding. It's about, to me, what COVID has shown us is that we need to have a paradigm shift. We need to take a different position ourselves in a different, and look at the world in a whole different way. And one of those learnings is looking at education holistically, as the Catalyst report so nicely articulated. It's not about learning how to read or learning how to do math. It's a holistic development of the human personality, the brain, all together, because you need a healthy environment to produce this healthy child, while celebrating the neurodiversity and all the differences between them, and celebrating them to be useful and not things that we are coping with. So it's not about doing the same thing like Robert Frost. It's about taking a whole new path, but by just shifting how we look at the problem and at the challenges. And how do we do that? I mean, it's changing our terminology, how we describe, how we put goals, by using new words that reflect how we think. Because if we keep using the same words, we're going to keep on thinking in the same way. We need to change that. Another thing that we learned from COVID is the importance of human-human interaction. Yes, technology is important, right? But I'm sure, Anne-Brigitte, you agree with me, play is all about the real human-human interaction for the brain development. Technology is good. So how do we harness it to our advantage rather than being slaves to that technology? Because we also know that I'm not going to quote a percentage, but the percentages of children who really have access to technology in a way that really is useful is very low, whether it's the internet or the device itself. So and again, let's hark back to how we evolved. How can we relinquish the parent or the community member, the grandmother interaction with the child, right? Because we know that's important for brain development. So how do we harness that for a better education system? And lastly, I'm going to talk about measurement. What COVID has shown, how do you measure impact, right? Again, we need to move away from the traditional frameworks and ways of doing that. And because we're thinking differently, we will measure differently, meaning we are looking long-term. We are looking at how is the person changing from the inside and not just mere numbers and statistics. So all this requires systems change, and it requires everybody. And again, I keep going back to global systems change, meaning you need a network to talk to everybody. And maybe back to the funding question that was brought up, how do you fund that, right? That looks so huge, but I think this is back to systems change. It's finding the pivotal points. Catalyst is such a wonderful network where by working on funding Catalyst, you're actually hitting so many birds. I hate the birds with one stone. We don't want to kill birds, but you know what I mean. That we can impact so much to achieve all and many of the SDGs together, because it's all about working holistically and collaboratively together.
Yes, please, Anne. Go ahead.
No, Rana just reminded me that one of the way that the Lego Foundation's funding has changed. That is into funding networks. So networks of grassroots educators, networks of social entrepreneurs, networks of teachers, networks of education policymakers across borders, so that it's not about us. It's about everybody in that network sharing their knowledge with each other. And then sometimes we listen in and we're going, so what's the main issue on the minds of social entrepreneurs working in early childhood development, for example, and you pick up trends in that, etc. And then as a funder, you can then go in and say, okay, there's a trend this way, or there's a problem here that everybody's grappling to try and solve. How can we go in with funds to try and catalyze that, rather than sitting in Denmark and saying, oh, we've got we've developed the holy grail on playful learning, but what's actually going on in the ecosystem and in the different networks. And I think that's something that we could encourage more to try and do as well.
Yeah, Rana, I'm just going to come to, and I think that's exactly will give you the opportunity to make your point, is that, I sometimes tear my hair apart. There's lots of people might be very skeptical about conferences like ours and say, yeah, it's just the preachy, everyone talking to the converted. They're just speaking to each other. And does this really result in real action on the ground is the question. And I think what we have gathered here today is that I don't think any of us disagree with the definition of education that we've been talking about. Resonates so well with all of us. And yet what I tear my hair out often is that why are government systems so resistant to all the effort that social entrepreneurs and non-government organizations are successfully offering? These are tried, tested solutions. And Rana, all of what we are trying to do, what Campus 2030 is trying to do is we're putting together this report that includes social entrepreneurs, policymakers, funders, youth, and around the 8 or 9 principles showing workable solutions. And we're really hoping to use this to have an impact on governments across the world. So my question to all of you, let your imaginations run wild. So if you had all the resources in the world, every last dollar in the universe, so how can we work together? What would we do together? Lego Foundation, UNESCO, all of us, Rana, to impact education systems globally. Campus 2030 is awesome. And we would love to collaborate. And I'm so glad you said that you were looking to fund networks. Well, then here's your opportunity. We have this report, and we are hoping that we can find people to work together. UNESCO is committed to working with us. How do we use it, and how can, if we had everything that we ever wanted, how would we impact global systems?
Well, right now, and maybe it's also beholden on me to actually say it, but I do think if we took all the funds available for education, whether that's government funds or international aid funds or private sector funds, etc., you need to try and figure out how funders fund the same kind of transformation. Because we also have to realize that while we don't disagree on the future of education, there's still a lot of money in the system that's driving a particular kind of education, or driving, I'd even say 20th century education. And I would say that if we had all the money, or if we had access to guide all the money, we would make sure that at least the funding is totally aligned with the 9 principles, and not with all sorts of other agendas, etc., that are out there. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I'll bridge off that and say, I think what we could best do is fully guarantee and deliver on the right to education. I mean, let's not forget that the rights argument is such an important, arrow in our quiver, or sort of resource in our pile. We shouldn't lose sight of that. And actually, if you stop and think about it, if we just delivered on the right to education, we wouldn't need to have this conversation about changing the narrative. We wouldn't need other reasons, right, to sort of justify why education is important. So that's what I would put forward, to as a sort of second step on Brigitte. Like, what is it that we could ground all this effort in? I think that's something not to be overlooked. The right to education, the right to quality education, probably expanded from its original definition 75 years ago to include a right to connectivity, maybe even a right to deconnectivity, but also right to information, right to benefit from scientific progress. And I think you can package that together in a way that would have a real impact in the world. So let's not lose sight of our reference to that really important concept and commitment.
Go ahead, Ron.
Sorry.
No, please.
From my point of view and perspective, I think if we had everything in the world, it's not just about money. It's about building trust. We need to trust each other at every level. And how do you build trust? You create an ecosystem where people feel comfortable to talk to each other, where all biases are removed. And how do you create this ecosystem? It's about bringing people together to engage, to listen, to talk to each other, and to build those collaborations, and then celebrate those success stories and showcase them to the world, because people are skeptical. They say it's not going to work. But it's like, media loves sensational negative stories, but we need to, if we talk about the positive stories, people who are skeptical say, oh, wait a minute, yeah, maybe that will work. And then you create that trust, which is back to the question about government. When a government official, if I trust him or her and she trusts me, the person on the ground, that's how we start working together, and we all feel that ownership and that agency, and that I'm doing this not because it's a job or I want to get something from my supervisor. I'm doing it because I care about my community, and that all comes from trusting in ourselves and our community and in humanity. And I think that's one of the lessons of COVID. How do we foster that trust? And how does money foster the trust? I think it's by funding networks of sincere people who come together, who want to make change, and then they will make their own change. It's just about creating the ecosystem, which is global systems change. Create an ecosystem, and then things will happen by themselves. It's like magic. And to me, it's like the butterfly effect, right? In physics, the chaos theory. When a butterfly flutters its wings, it moves the air a centimeter, but change in time and space happens. And similarly, if we can focus on those pivotal points that create global systems change, one of them is building trust, creating collaborations, and Catalyst has shown a success story that this works, then yes, change will happen. But we also need to be careful. We're not looking at change happening overnight. And if it does, it's not real in my book. Real change takes time. So it's about being patient. It's about long-term investment and building trust again.
And I just come in really quickly with one thing. Trust is so important with each other. And I think the other piece of trust is that I think we need to trust that we can move from a paradigm of scarcity to a paradigm of abundance. And I'm not just talking about the financial resources, as you were saying, Urvashi. I mean, reconceptualizing how we think about learning and knowledge, right? There is an abundance of knowledge out there in the world, and more people getting access to it creates more. It's an undepletable resource. In fact, its use builds it. And the same is true for learning. Unfortunately, though, so many of our education systems are built on sorting and protecting and regulating that. We just need, that's, I think, the paradigm we need to break. So, and just trust that when we get to a point of really sharing knowledge, allowing everyone to build knowledge, that kind of abundance is going to serve us all so much better than our current scarcity paradigms do.
Democratizing education in the true sense of the word, right? Opening up learning spaces, opening up even teaching. That why one teacher, why one classroom, why not a learning team, which was what we at the Centenarians Project, our Room 4 was pushing for the learning teams. Yes, But once again, I have that question. And again, when you talked about trust, Rana, I'm thinking of, well, in Catalyst 2030 itself, we have 1,600 social entrepreneurs, out of which the largest chunk is really working on education, right? And they have great innovations, they have proven track record, they're working at a fair degree of scale. At the same time, the problem persists. And thinking of Catalyst 2030 is trying to harness the energy and the work of all of them together and give them a place of at the table so that we can make our voices heard. That report again is one way of doing this. So, and you spoke of, that all funders looking in the same direction. And Noah, absolutely no dispute about the right to education. The problem is that everybody uses education in very different ways. It's almost so that term is, the definition of that term is already defined, and then that's the old definition. The important thing is and even quality education, even when there's a lament about it, it's about basic skills. Oh, so many kids can't read and write. Oh, so many kids can't, which is all very important. At the same time, no one is saying that, oh, we haven't used education to teach children's citizenship. There isn't enough peace education. There isn't enough gender education in the classroom. No one is saying that, right? And that's the paradigm also that we're trying to shift. So once again, that to ask the question more concretely, that there is this group of people who have worked very hard at redefining education, and they've done it on the ground. It's not in theory, it's in practice. And they've shown the results. At the same time, government systems are insensitive to that. They seem almost untouched, or it's so slow, so tiny that it doesn't even show. So how do you get government systems to trust the people, we the people? How do we get them to look at us as part of we the people? And how can we get them to change the people? Past experience.
There is no other way than trust, conversation, and national compact of interest in education that can take years to develop. I've worked most of my career in the health sector and not in the education sector. And the one thing that helped the health sector was that there were sets of global standards of what good looked like. You've got a standardized approach to all sorts of interventions, whether it's in primary health or whether it's in the more complex brain surgery operations. You've got a shared set of standards. This doesn't exist in education, and you cannot actually change and do systemic change in a void. You have to have probably starting with national or even community conversations around what does good education look like for us? What's needed in our communities? What do the children need? What are we looking for? Not driven just by the private sector in terms of, oh, we need these skills for the jobs of the future, but what are the life skills? What does society actually mean? And within that, you can then live together. I think that what I've learned from the health sector, and as I've transitioned into the education system, is that lack of the umbrella. And can I just link to Noah's call for focusing on the right to education? There is a beautiful commentary that was written almost 20 years ago by the Committee on the Rights of the Child about a definition of what good education is. It's the first recorded official committee commentary on education. Maybe we just start there, because it takes its starting point exactly in the need for learner-centric education, for peace building, for collaboration, for context-specific, cultural-specific education norms, etc. And it is actually quite a beautiful starting point, not just with the right itself, but with the work that experts did many years ago about what is really the purpose of education. If we could just agree on that, maybe we could start that conversation and the transformation. But in the meantime, I think we all see ourselves as drops in that big wave that has to come, the big tsunami of transformation, and we can keep trying to be smart funders, smart entrepreneurs, smart policymakers to keep the conversation going. But there is a big picture thing, and I actually think the UNESCO report helps us all try and reframe what good looks like in education.
And yes, and we have just 4 minutes left and many questions in the chat box, which I can't address. So we've been trying to address them as we go along. That's why, Noah, if you take one last for a last word,
very
and
quickly,
Rana, you too.
I agree. Good local conversations, and recognize that they don't start from something. They build on what we have already, like resources that you just mentioned, Anne-Brigitte. I hope the UNESCO report will be one of those resources. I think part of this is recognizing that this is always going to be an iterative, ongoing process of dialogue and action so that we can make futures together, and we treat future making as a democratic participatory process. We in the UNESCO report, we proposed 3 questions to guide this. First, what are we doing now that we should continue doing? I think that's a very important first orienting stance. What should be strengthened? What should be protected? Second, what should be abandoned? What should we move away from? What do we need to unlearn? And again, a collective conversation within a community and explaining why. What are the what about that rubs against our values, rubs against the futures we want for ourselves, our kids, and our descendants. And then finally, also to identify what are the things that need to be creatively reinvented afresh, and this is where a lot of the brilliant catalyst people come in. What are the things that we don't know how to do, we not necessarily need to stop doing, but need to reinvent? So those 3 questions I think are useful for reframing this as an iterative process that involves local communities, but also involves governments. Thanks.
Thank you, Noah. In fact, our report is doing all of those things. It is built out of a conversation with educators, with entrepreneurs, with policymakers, with funders, and with the youth, most importantly, people who are normally left out, and it's global. And I'm really thinking that all of the things that we've said, if just the people here, if we could collaborate, we could partner and really start a movement to redefine education on the ground in large systems and work at systems change, a great deal would happen. Rana, please.
Actually, exactly what I was going to say is like, we're here today. It's May 9th. It's the first day of the Catalyzing Week, Catalyzing Change Week. We're right coming out of COVID, we hope. And we're here. We have Anne-Brigitte from Lego, we have Noah from UNESCO, and we are representing the social entrepreneurs on the ground. So it's like we have the right ingredients, the right ecosystem. Why? And we have to start somewhere, right? It doesn't mean we're going to solve everything, but let's start. So this is a call, an invitation that I'm proposing, Anne-Brigitte and Noah from UNESCO to let's put our hands together as Catalyst 2030 with you as a funder, as a government, UN agency, and let's plan a reimagining of education through global systems change. So at least we come out with an action item.
Yes, and let's use the conversation that we started. Let's take it forward and let's work together. I think that's an important thing. So thank you all. I think that was really a vibrant conversation. Thanks very much for all your experience, for bringing everything that you've learned and think about and do to the conversation. And thank you all for listening and thank you for all your comments. I'm so sorry that we couldn't have a Q&A session.
Thanks, Urvashi, and everyone who made this possible.
Bye.
And we will be concluding with a video of, actually we wanted to start with it, but we will be concluding with a video of what the people in the community have to say about education. We wanted to start with it, but technology doesn't always collaborate. So, sorry. So Deepa, Mishri, in fact, we can showcase the video and take that as the closing as we go, if that's possible. Deepa, Mishri?
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's clear, right?
Yeah, we can see.